Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes. All right, so just getting right into this, we're going to skip our scope here for the most part. Bacon writes an important book called the Novum Organum, so we need to understand something that goes a little bit earlier to this. Around the time that Bacon is writing, a major book was in use called The Organ by Aristotle, which kind of was comprised of all of the major writings of Aristotle popular at the time, and it was considered to be kind of a complete curriculum. If you were going to be educated, you were probably familiar with Aristotle's Organ. So by writing this, Bacon is saying, here is the new version of that. So he's giving authority to empirical observation and the experimental method because he really wants to know if there are multiple different causes of things that are possible, which one is the one we ought to favor. So he's not really criticizing antiquity the way we might interpret as doing this. He really wants us to have disinterested and objective inquiry. Now, disinterested does not mean uninterested. Rather, disinterested means we don't really have a stake in the game. We don't care what the outcome is. We are completely neutral in approaching this to try and find something. And what he tells us is that whatever we discover from these experiments is going to be recorded in our table of discovery. So you might think of the periodic table of the elements, for instance, as doing exactly that. It's all of the information that we have, but it's presented in a readily reliable, easily referenced kind of way. Experimental science, then, isn't just when we go into the laboratory and we blow our eyebrows off with different chemicals and this and that, but it is something that we're going to use to discover real truth. In experimental science, all of that good thinking is done before we ever go into the lab. Then when we're in the lab, we're seeing which possible explanation our findings tend to support. What are the conclusions that the findings favor? Now, when the writers of the 18th century Enlightenment are looking back to the century before them, they're saying this is a new age of science, the age of Isaac Newton, and really, Bacon is going to be a prophet of Newton. So the Renaissance, remember we described as kind of a Janus-looking age, looking forward and backward. Bacon and the Elizabethans are looking forward only. So Queen Elizabeth, who looks a lot like Larry from the Three Stooges, and indeed thinks of her age as a very singular one. If the Renaissance was in transition, the Elizabethan age is very much this futuristic and evolutionary kind of outlook. They're trying to make sure that progress is constantly being achieved, no matter how grand that might be. Now, Bacon's Novum Organum, his new method, is central to what he calls a great instauration, a new beginning, basically, of the knowledge that we glean from science. He's not saying that anything that came before was bad, but just to say, look, the ancient world had a limited knowledge, and we can get past that. The Novum Organum, then, says there's an epistemological authority of experimental science. Remember, episteme is knowledge in Greek. Epistemological discusses what we can claim to know. So what Bacon is giving us here is this table of discovery, pardon the graphic. It's a set of disciplined and systematic observations of the natural world. So traditionally, we've described epistemology as where truth and belief overlap to form knowledge. And we're not leaving that model behind, but instead here, our beliefs are going to be framed as hypotheses, our truth will be borne out through experimentation, and ultimately the knowledge is going to be recorded on that table of discovery. Now, one of the things that's really neat about Francis Bacon is he's actually very readable. So as an essayist and as just a science writer in general, he's very good to sit down and read and is very capable of being learned from. So what is this new method? Is it more than just gathering facts? Well, yes, it is. The experimental method is kind of broken down to two distinct categories. The experimenta lucifera are the light-bringing or light-shedding experiments. This kind of shows us what are the causes of things. How does A operate upon B, and so on and so forth. So these are systematic studies. These are mechanical, causal type relationships that we're going to record in our table of discovery. Now, the cool thing is, he's doing this at a time where nothing is off limits. Things that in the past, like dissecting corpses, as shown here in the Rembrandt painting, this is what the experimental lucifera is all about, because we are literally shedding light on that which before was not available to us. The experimenta fructifera, or fruit-bearing experiments, are going to be the other side of that. And we don't really need to worry too much about that for our purposes. Now, in this time, science is not just going to study the natural world, it's going to study the mind of the inquirer as well. Bacon would call it human philosophy. We would now call it psychology. Bacon understands there's things that are going to explain certain human behaviors, some as segregate, others as aggregate. The segregate, this is what the empirikoi were doing. So any kind of systematic scientific psychology is going to come down to physiological or medical psychology. So the segregate person is biological or medical modes of thinking about how all the different things in our bodies, in our physiology, come about, to include intellectually. The aggregate is going to kind of follow Aristotle and will say that, well, a developed psychology includes things like ethics, politics, moral thought, biology, and that really we're a product of all of our experiences combined. So, how is Bacon departing from the ancients? He's not saying that the ancients didn't do all these things. Indeed, they did. The Hippocratics were aware of systematic observation, and Bacon refers to them quite favorably. By the 2nd century, for instance, Galen, the guy that's portrayed there on the left, really had a pretty good understanding of how experimental science could be conducted in medicine. He kept careful, if kind of gruesome records, of how of his operations and his experiments went well or didn't. So when Francis is talking about a new method, he's not talking about something brand new to the world. He's talking about something that's new as compared to, say, the Scholastic period or the natural magic of the Renaissance. So Bacon does start off this great instauration, this new beginning, and it's an invitation to a method to extract secrets from nature that hasn't been used more or less since the Greeks. The light of experience and the discipline of experiment are the best way, says Bacon, to address our problem of knowledge. And he tells us words are but the images of matter. To fall in love with them is all as one to fall in love with a picture. So, for instance, the bacon cheeseburger we see there on the right is a very enticing image, but that image itself isn't going to sate our hunger. If anything, it's probably going to make us maybe a little more hungry. So now we're going to turn our attention to René Descartes, and we move from experience over to reason. We're going to skip our scope here and just get right into it. So one of the things to be aware of Cartesian thought, that of Descartes, is it's axiomatic. It's trying to come up with things that are consistent and which are kind of free of controversy. So the modern period of philosophy, in a lot of accounts, begins with Descartes. He's interested in analytical geometry. He's interested, as we've seen other philosophers are, in optics and physiology. Descartes' mom dies within a year of his birth. He goes to live with his grandmother. She dies by the time he's 10. He gets enrolled at the Jesuit school at Les Flèches, and he's writing back and forth. He's kind of pen pals with a lot of the great intellectual scientific people of his time. Earns a law degree at Poitiers, fights as a mercenary in the Dutch Army's War of Independence against Spain, which is pretty cool. And in 1619, he has this dream that tells him to create a new and daring path to knowledge. Descartes was schooled in scholastic philosophy, and he says it's very logically rigorous, but they don't appear to be discovering anything new. And the Renaissance science was really just dogma, rote teaching, posing as knowledge. So he summarizes his thoughts in Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. When we've got different opinions, when we have perceived errors in a group that thinks differently from ourselves, he said it's not because one person or the other is stupid, it's because we have faulty methods of inquiry and faulty methods of discovery. In fact, everything that's grounded in perception is subject to distortion. That is, we can be wrong about things. So if we look at history, especially comparative history, it's going to kind of take us out of the context of these things. No two historical events are ever quite the same, and the closest we can get to are generalities subject to interpretation. So, excellent movie recommendation. Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon tells the exact same story of a crime committed, but it tells it from 4 or 5 different perspectives, and the viewer is kind of left to suss out the truth on themselves. The other film there to the right, Vantage Point, kind of does the same sort of thing. This is a good way to understand what Descartes is talking about. At the end of the day, though, philosophy doesn't have just a single method that it uses. Math can give us some kinds of indisputable truths, but it really can't be a method of discovery. In Descartes' discourse on method, really what he wants to do is find some mode of inquiry that would save himself from making errors. And to do this, he has to start with a position where he says, I don't know anything. What this is going to do is get out any perceptual distractions that might confuse him. Perceptions and feeling aside, the other thing that the mind does is think. So Descartes says, I don't think that anything exists. I don't even think that I exist. But wait, doubting is a kind of thinking. I seem to be the thing that thinks. I think, therefore I exist. Or I think, therefore I am. Or in the Latin, cogito ergo sum. This is a summary of the grounds on which he's going to base all knowledge claims. So Descartes begins by assuming that you can't say that you're an extended thing, a bodily thing, a res extensa, because all descriptions about actions, well, we're the subject there. We could just be distracted somehow, or he said, a malignant demon could be fooling us into thinking that we have a body. I won't ask you to read this entire thing, although if you'd like to, you can certainly pause the video and read through it. But what we're really interested in takes place in that fifth frame in the middle on the bottom there. Evidence requires its own evidence, and you wind up with an infinite chain of proof. And that's a really problematic position. At some point, you have to say, these are the things that we believe, and just build on from that point. So you might never be able to actually distinguish whether you're in an actual reality or a dreamed reality, because all of our empirical modes, that which we see, taste, touch, hear, smell, and so on, could be subject to deceptions. Now, one thing that's really kind of inseparably bound up with the reality of our being is our thought. In this extent, we are a res cogitans, or a thinking thing. That's kind of the point of the cogito ergo sum. It's not to really cast doubts on our own existence. It's a precondition for skepticism. Without thinking, you can't possibly doubt anything. And without doubting, you can't be an effective skeptic. So Descartes arrived at this through a rational analysis, this axiomatic method. And there's 4 main approaches to this. They are: accept nothing as true except that which shows itself with a complete clarity and vividness that we can't doubt. Then we divide problems into as many smaller steps as possible. We call this analysis and synthesis. We solve the smallest problem all the way up to the problems of greater complexity in order, and whatever solutions we come up with, we test them over and over to make sure that there aren't exceptions or qualifications. So now that he's got this method of inquiry, Descartes is going to turn to what we call philosophy of mind. He wants to know, how do our bodies and our minds connect? How do they interact? To distinguish between the res extensa and the res cogitans is the mind-body problem. So how does the material body make the immaterial mind think? How can an unextended immaterial mind make a material body move? So Descartes said that this happens hydraulically, which in some ways it kind of does. But the physics of motion only account for these rudimentary sensor motor functions. But they can't be the cause of purely abstract features of mental life, like imagination, religious faith, and so on. So Descartes describes something that we would call artificial intelligence. Could you make something that was indistinguishable from a human being if all of the stuff that we can explain about ourselves is mechanical? Could we make something that was a perfect copy of us? And he says no, because it would never attain the idea of God. It could also never traffic in abstract reasoning, like we use a lot of in mathematics, and it could never use language in a creatively discursive fashion, like puns and limericks and so on and so forth. Descartes is also infamous for espousing innate ideas, this idea that some knowledge we're simply born with, that we must have as part of our rational power. This is kind of like Socrates' Meno that we discussed earlier in the semester. So we've got an if then statement. If our own experiences are all that could possibly occupy the mind, our sensory experiences, there'd be no basis for assuming there's an actual external material world causing them. Now, at the end of the day, we know there's an external world. Nobody's really doubtful about that. If we put these two facts together, we know that there is really and reliably an external world around us. We know that we couldn't arrive at the idea of matter from just the phenomenology of experience alone. So, how are we going to put this together that the thinking thing is indeed us, the experiences of a material something? Descartes' new method begins as a skepticism and then uses reason and rational argument to defeat skepticism. This is a really interesting and completely analytical approach to solving our problem of knowledge, and it's going to follow kind of mathematic developments and a generally developed life on the affairs of life and the mind. It's a new approach to how we can know. That is as far as we go for now. I hope you've enjoyed this and learned something. Thank you, and bye-bye.